Spanish Civil War, alternate history 1936 to 1939, background and ideological roots. The origins of Spain's anarchist revolution trace back to 19th century ideological conflicts within the international socialist movement. A fundamental divergence emerged between Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin in the First International, 1864 to 1872, shaping the paths of socialism and anarchism. Marx advocated a dictatorship of the proletariat, a centralized workers' state to forcibly reorganize society, whereas Bakunin and his followers warned that any new state, even a socialist one, would inevitably become oppressive. Bakunin, joined by Peter Kropotkin, author of The Conquest of Bread, envisioned a stateless, collectivist society built on voluntary federation. They wrote extensively on the need to abolish the state and private ownership of the means of production, rejecting authoritarian methods. These ideas strongly influenced Spanish radicals. Anarchism had been uniquely strong in Spain since the late 19th century, taking root among the industrial workers of Catalonia and the impoverished peasants of Andalusia. By the early 20th century, Spain's anarchist movement was the most mass-based in the world. The anarcho-syndicalist trade union Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, CNT, founded in 1910, grew to over 1 million members by 1936. Its militant wing, the Federación Anarquista Ibérica, FAI, ensured that revolutionary principles guided the union. Decades of labor unrest, including brutal reprisals like the massacre of 70 workers in the 1917 general strike, had taught Spanish anarchists to distrust all state authority. In response, they organized clandestine defense committees, armed worker cells, in the 1920s and 1930s to prepare for an eventual revolution. There can be no revolution without preparation. We have to put an end to the prejudice in favor of improvisation, declared a CNT secret bulletin in 1934, reflecting the move towards serious, methodical organizing for armed uprising. By the time Spain became a republic in 1931, anarchist and socialist unions had laid deep roots, though they viewed the new liberal government with skepticism. Tensions intensified through the Second Republic, 1931 to 1936, as landowners and right-wing forces resisted reform, and leftist factions, anarchists, socialists, and communists, jockeyed over the path to revolution. In this alternate history scenario, the Spanish anarchists took heed of advice from veteran revolutionaries abroad. Nestor Makhno, the exiled Ukrainian anarchist who had fought the Bolsheviks, had penned an open letter in 1931 urging the Spaniards to unite the libertarian forces and form armed volunteer groups federated with the CNT. Crucially, Makhno warned against any alliance with Soviet-backed communists, predicting that the Spanish Communist Party would inevitably betray their allies, with an eye to establishing the power of their party, as happened in Russia. The CNT-FAI leadership in this timeline took these warnings to heart, maintaining ideological independence from authoritarian communists. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in July 1936, the anarchists were thus in a strong position, organizationally, ideologically, and materially, to influence the course of events. Outbreak of the Civil War, July 1936. The Civil War began with a military coup launched by right-wing generals against the center-left Popular Front government. On July 17 to 19, 1936, Generals Francisco Franco, Emilio Mola, and others moved to seize power. Crucially, however, the coup did not go as planned. In this alternate history, the response of the Spanish labor movement, especially the anarchist and socialist organizations, was even more decisive than in reality. In Barcelona, workers' militias led by the CNT-FAI rose up immediately to defend the Republic. Having anticipated the coup, anarchist defense committees sprang into action and raided government arsenals for weapons, with help from sympathetic soldiers and police. Contemporary accounts describe how, on the 19th of July, CNT and UGT trade unionists organized themselves into militia units and took weapons from the arsenals with the support of the people responsible for the arsenals, mostly non-commissioned officers. Armed with rifles, machine guns, and a few field pieces from local armories, the workers fought street by street to defeat the rebel army garrison. By July 20th, the anarchist militia, led by renowned figures like Buenaventura Durruti, had stormed the last rebel stronghold, the Atarazanas barracks in Barcelona. General Goded, the coup leader in Catalonia, was captured, and the entire region of Catalonia came under worker control within days. Similar scenarios played out across eastern and southern Spain. In Valencia, Madrid, and many industrial towns, spontaneously armed trade unionists confronted rebel officers before they could secure the cities. They were often aided by portions of the security forces, assault guards and civil guards, who remained loyal to the Republic or refused to join the coup. Even in Andalusia, a heartland of anarchist peasant activism, the coup met fiercer resistance than expected. In real history, cities like Seville and Granada fell quickly to the nationalists. But in this alternate timeline, agrarian anarchist militants, forewarned of the general's plans, organized general strikes and rural defenses. For example, in Seville, a mass mobilization of CNT dock workers and railwaymen delayed General Capo de Llano's takeover, allowing loyal police and Republican troops to regroup. Though Seville eventually fell after heavy fighting, the rebels there were badly bloodied, and crucially, the nationalists failed to capture Zaragoza in Aragon. Zaragoza, a city with a large anarcho-syndicalist presence, historically had been lost to the rebels due to the Republican hesitation and the militia's lack of arms. Durruti's anarchist column had fought hard but was unable to liberate the town in the real timeline. Zrania, stalling outside Zaragoza. In this scenario, however, the anarchists did not repeat that mistake. The Durruti column, swelled by worker volunteers to over 6,000 strong, pushed decisively towards Zaragoza in late July. They overcame the rebels in the surrounding towns and, with the aid of a few renegade army units and artillery pieces captured en route, stormed Zaragoza in early August 1936. This deprived General Mola of his key base in the northeast and kept open the vital corridor between Catalonia and Madrid. Analysts later noted that the anarchists' bold advance succeeded in part because they had mitigated the chronic arms shortages that hampered them in reality. In 1936, Durruti's men had famously lacked heavy weapons and had to halt at the city gates for fear of disaster. But in this alternate outcome, they pressed the attack with greater firepower and coordination. Across Basque Country and Asturias in the north, regional nationalist and moderate left forces also resisted the coup, though these areas were less influenced by anarchism. Nonetheless, the broader Republican coalition, consisting of anarchists, socialists, communists, and Basque and Catalan nationalists, managed to retain control of roughly two-thirds of Spain after the first weeks of fighting. Crucially, all of Spain's main industrial regions and largest cities, Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, stayed in Republican hands, providing a strong economic and strategic base. The nationalists under Franco held much of the rural interior and parts of the northwest, Galicia and Old Castile, but found themselves largely isolated to geographically scattered pockets. Frustrated in his plan for a swift power grab, Franco regrouped in Spanish Morocco, where the elite army of Africa, Spanish Foreign Legion and Moorish Regulares, was stationed. With the navy mostly loyal to the Republic, sailors' committees had mutinied against many rebel officers, Franco had to rely on airlift support from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany to ferry his colonial troops to southern Spain. As in actual history, Hitler and Mussolini provided transport aircraft and weapons in defiance of the non-intervention pact. Despite these foreign airlifts, Franco's initial reinforcements landed into a much more hostile environment. In Cadiz and Malaga, they faced well-armed worker battalions rather than disorganized militias. The Republican Navy, though short on fuel and experienced commanders, managed to intercept some transports. At least one ship carrying rebel troops was sunk in the Strait of Gibraltar in August, an event that further limited Franco's troop movements. The Army of Africa eventually fought its way into Andalusia, capturing cities like Córdoba and Granada with superior discipline and brutality, but it failed to score the rapid knockout blow Franco had hoped for. Instead of marching unopposed to Madrid, Franco's forces became bogged down in drawn-out battles against determined popular resistance in the south. By late 1936, the Civil War had crystallized into a prolonged conflict rather than a quick coup d'état. The fronts roughly divided Spain between the Republican zone, controlling the east, including Catalonia, Levante, and much of central Spain, and the nationalist zone, controlling the northwest and a band of territory in the south. The early success of the anarchist-led masses in disrupting the coup set the stage for a very different trajectory of the war, one in which the revolutionary energies of the working class were unleashed to a far greater degree than in our timeline. The social revolution and war effort. In the Republican-held areas, victory over the coup was followed by an immense social revolution. With conservative forces ousted from power locally, workers and peasants implemented anarchist and socialist principles in real time, even as the war raged. Much of the Spanish economy was placed under direct worker control. In anarchist strongholds like Catalonia, as much as 75% of industry and trade was soon run by workers' committees. Factories, transportation, and public services in Barcelona were collectivized. Tram drivers, for example, kept the city running under a workers' management committee. In the countryside, especially Aragon and Andalusia, landless laborers seized great estates and formed collectives, farming cooperatively and sharing the harvest. Money was in some places abolished or replaced by local coupons. Many villages in Aragon formed libertarian communist communes. These sweeping changes mirrored those that indeed occurred during the real Spanish Revolution of 1936. Zrania, but in this alternate scenario they endured and expanded rather than being rolled back mid-war. A dual power structure initially emerged. On one hand, the formal Republican government, now led by Socialist Prime Minister Francisco Largo Caballero, still existed and sought to direct the war effort. On the other, real power in the streets and fields often lay with the revolutionary committees of workers, peasants, and anti-fascist militias. For a time, these groups cooperated against the common fascist enemy. A central committee of anti-fascist militias in Catalonia, for example, coordinated military operations in lieu of the discredited pre-war authorities. Anarchists joined this committee. Despite comprising the majority in Catalonia, they took only 1/3 of the seats to maintain a broad front. However, deep ideological tensions between the anarchists and the communists soon surfaced. The Communist Party, PCE, and its allies with support from the Soviet Union advocated centralizing the armed forces and postponing the social revolution until after winning the war. The anarchists and their allies, like the POUM, an anti-Stalinist Marxist party, insisted that the war and revolution were inseparable, that fighting fascism had to go hand in hand with building a new egalitarian society. This fundamental conflict led to a power struggle within the Republican camp. In May 1937, these tensions exploded into the open in Barcelona. The trigger was an attempt by the communist-influenced police to seize the telephone exchange controlled by CNT workers, sparking street fighting known as the May Days. In the actual history, the May Days ended with the government and communists undermining the anarchists. Leaders of the CNT were co-opted or repressed, and the revolutionary gains began to be rolled back. In our alternate timeline, by contrast, the anarchists retained the upper hand in the May 1937 events. When Catalan police, under orders from the communist FSUC, moved on the telephone exchange, armed CNT militias across the city rose in solidarity with the telephone workers. Barricades went up in Barcelona as anarchists and the anti-Stalinist POUM fought back the assault. Thanks to their greater preparation and unity, and an unwillingness to compromise their revolution, the workers repelled the police attack and held their strategic positions. After a tense week, the Generalitat, Catalan government, backed down. the CNTFAI maintained control of Catalonia, and the influence of the Soviet-backed communists in that region was effectively nullified. Pyongyang, which in reality was outlawed and its leader Andres Nin murdered by Soviet agents, survived this showdown in the alternate timeline. Though a number of lives were lost in the Barcelona fighting, the outcome solidified anarchist dominance. The revolution would not be sacrificed for wartime expediency. Notably, this fulfilled Makhno's prophecy. The CNT had steered clear of unity with Bolshevik communists who would betray the revolution. Swing, and when push came to shove, the anarchists forcefully asserted their autonomy rather than submit to communist directives. After May 1937, the Republican zone was effectively led by a libertarian socialist alliance. The central government in Valencia was reshuffled to include more left socialists, anarcho-syndicalists, and liberal Republicans who agreed to tolerate the ongoing revolution. The Soviet Union's role diminished. Stalin had been supplying arms to the Republic in exchange for Spain's gold reserves, but always under strict political conditions. With the anarchists refusing to cede control, Soviet aid became limited and eventually halted by mid-1938. In the long run, this proved to be a mixed blessing. Although the Republic lost a major source of tanks and planes, it also freed itself from internal subversion by Stalinist agents. The Spanish revolutionaries turned instead to self-reliance and grassroots international support. International support and volunteers. While no nation's government formally allied with Republican Spain, the Western democracies remained ostensibly neutral, and the USSR gave only conditional support. International civil society rallied to the Spanish cause. Anarchists, socialists, and anti-fascists worldwide saw the Spanish conflict as a decisive battle against fascism and for social justice. Thousands of foreign volunteers flooded into Spain to help the Republican side, far more than in the original timeline, especially under anarchist auspices. In this alternate scenario, the famous communist-organized international brigades were matched by equally significant anarchist volunteer contingents. The Durruti column, for example, included an international group of foreign fighters within its ranks. According to records, the column's international section contained volunteers from France, Italy, Germany, Britain, the United States, and even Morocco, organized into units like the French-Italian Sacco and Vanzetti Century. Many foreign volunteers gravitated to anarchist militias specifically, inspired by reports of the unfolding social revolution. In fact, 2,000 to 3,000 foreign anarchists fought in Spain. By comparison, the Communist International Brigades enlisted about 35,000. Among these were 100 to 200 Americans and large numbers of French, Italian, Belgian, German, Polish, and Latin American volunteers. They formed their own sections or joined existing militia columns. For instance, Italian anarchist exiles who had been living in France crossed the Pyrenees days after the coup. One group formed the Italian section of the Ascaso column, seeing action near Huesca in August 1936. One of them, the 57-year-old Michel Centroni of San Francisco, became one of the first foreign casualties, killed at Monte Pelado. Other foreigners joined the Sebastian IV Century, named after a French anarchist, or the Erich Mühsam Century, comprised mainly of Germans, under CNT command. Even some veterans of past revolutions joined the fight. Notably, veterans of Nestor Makhno's Ukrainian anarchist army, who had fled Soviet persecution in the 1920s, made their way to Spain. Several dozen of Makhno's Makhnovist fighters enlisted in the Durruti column in 1936, bringing invaluable military experience to the anarchists. Their presence was symbolically powerful. It underscored the continuity of the anarchist struggle from Ukraine to Spain and provided skilled guerrilla fighters who had battled the Red and White armies in the Russian Civil War. Support for the anarchist-led cause also took the form of material aid from abroad, raised through non-governmental channels. Labor unions, leftist organizations, and ad hoc committees on multiple continents gathered funds and supplies for Spain. In the United States, for example, the anarchist-aligned International Workers of the World, IWW, and the Spanish Labor Defense League, an anarchist federation of immigrant workers, coordinated fundraising drives. By late 1936, they had raised over $100,000 for the CNT war effort, a huge sum during the Great Depression. With these funds, they attempted to smuggle arms to Spain in defiance of their own government's embargo. One clandestine arms shipment aboard the ship Mar Cantabrico in January 1937 carried rifles, machine guns, ammunition, and even 5 American volunteers for the anarchist militias. Tragically, that ship was intercepted by Franco's navy, the weapons never reached Spain, and the captured crew and volunteers were executed. Other small-scale operations had more success. Some anarchist sources allude to smuggled munitions from America through France, suggesting that modest quantities of arms did evade the naval patrols and bolster the Spanish revolutionaries. Likewise, anarchist dock workers in port cities like Marseille and Rotterdam often helped divert shipments of rifles or medicine to Spain. Mexico, under leftist President Lázaro Cárdenas, was the only government openly supportive of the Spanish Republic. Mexico provided rifles and a few planes to the Republicans, as happened in real history. And in this alternate timeline, much of that aid reached the anarchist-dominated militias rather than only the communist-directed units. Volunteers also came from as far afield as Latin America, North Africa, and the Middle East. Idealists from countries with their own social struggles, e.g., Cuban, Argentine, and Mexican anarcho-syndicalists, traveled to Spain to join what they saw as a world revolution. A contingent of Tunisian and Algerian port workers, mostly French-controlled North African anarchists and socialists, arrived in 1937 and formed a North African detachment fighting on the Madrid front. There was even a group of exiled Korean anarchists, veterans of Shin Chae-ho's Korean Anarchist Federation, who made the journey to Spain via Shanghai and Paris, eager to support anti-fascist efforts and learn from the Spanish Revolution for their own anti-colonial struggle. All these international volunteers fighting under the black and red anarchist banner helped offset the significant foreign support that Franco's nationalists were receiving from the Axis powers. While Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy supplied Franco with some 80,000 troops, 750 aircraft, and 150 tanks over the course of the war. The Republic's foreign allies were unofficial and non-state, but they provided what they could in people, passion, and propaganda. The presence of foreign fighters in anarchist units also had an effect on morale. It reinforced the belief that Spain was not isolated and that the struggle there was a beacon for the world's oppressed. Not all foreign aid to the Republic went through anarchist channels. The Communist International Brigades still formed and fought bravely at Madrid, Jarama, and elsewhere. But significantly, many independent left-wing volunteers chose to fight with the anarchists instead of, or in addition to, the communist-led brigades. For instance, British writer George Orwell came to Spain to fight fascism. Historically, he served with the POUM militia on the Aragon front. In this alternate scenario, Orwell's experience was similar. He fought shoulder to shoulder with anarchists at the front of Aragon and later wrote of the astonishing egalitarian spirit he witnessed, much as he did in Homage to Catalonia. He famously remarked on the democratic ethos of the militia units, where officers and privates ate the same rations and saluted no one, symbolizing the new world in the making. Orwell also noted the severe supply problems the militias faced, the dreadful old blunderbusses we had at the front, a problem gradually eased by captured enemy arms and smuggled weapons as the war went on. Major campaigns and turning points. Through late 1936 and 1937, the Spanish Civil War ground on as a bitter contest of attrition. The nationalists, under General Franco's overall command, enjoyed advantages in military hierarchy and external armaments, while the Republicans leveraged their superior manpower, industrial base, and revolutionary fervor. Several major campaigns defined the conflict's course. Siege of Madrid, October 1936, March 1937. Franco made Madrid the primary target in the autumn of 1936, hoping to break the Republic's morale by seizing the capital. His forces approached Madrid from the west. reinforced by crack units of the Army of Africa and Italian fascist Black Shirt divisions. The defense of Madrid became a symbol of resistance. Republican forces, including regular army units, socialist and communist militias, and anarchist columns from Catalonia, united to hold the city. Buenaventura Durruti led 3,000 of his anarchist fighters from Aragon to Madrid in November 1936, significantly bolstering the city's defenses. The battle for Madrid was ferocious. Street-by-street fighting raged in the University City and Casa de Campo. Tragically, Durruti was killed by a sniper's bullet on November 20th, 1936, while commanding a sector of the front. His death was a severe blow to the anarchists, but he died defending the revolution at its most critical moment, becoming a martyr whose memory inspired others to carry on. Madrid did not fall. The slogan, "No pasarán," they shall not pass, made famous by communist leader Dolores Ibárruri, La Pasionaria, held true. By early 1937, Franco's assault on Madrid had stalled, marking the first major nationalist setback. International brigades, volunteers organized by the Comintern, played a notable role in the defense, and so did the anarchist militias. Even pro-Republican women's battalions took up arms. The failure to take Madrid forced Franco into a longer, protracted war on multiple fronts. Campaigns in the north, 1937, Franco then turned to the industrial north, Basque Country and Asturias, aiming to secure resources and eliminate the northern Republican enclave. In our timeline, the north fell by late 1937 after brutal campaigns. Guernica was bombed by the German Condor Legion in April 1937, and Bilbao fell in June. In the alternate scenario, these events still occurred, but with some differences. The Basque Country, governed by its own autonomous government allied to the Republic, fought desperately against nationalist encroachment. The bombing of Guernica on April 26, 1937, the annihilation of an undefended town by German aircraft, did happen and shocked the world. News of this atrocity galvanized even greater international support for Republican Spain. Pablo Picasso's painting Guernica would become an enduring symbol of fascist terror. Bilbao, the Basque capital, eventually fell to Franco's forces, but at a higher cost and a slower pace than in reality, because the nationalists had to divert troops to contain anarchist advances elsewhere, e.g. around Zaragoza and the Central Front. The delay allowed many Basque refugees and some units to evacuate by sea to France, and crucially it tied down Franco's troops longer in the north. Aragon Front and Eastern Offensive. After consolidating Catalonia and capturing Zaragoza, the anarchist-led Eastern armies attempted to push westward. They liberated much of Aragon's countryside, establishing the Council of Aragon, a regional federation of communes under CNT militias' protection. Their progress beyond Zaragoza was slow due to thin supply lines and lack of heavy artillery. By late 1937, a quasi-stalemate set in. The Republicans held a line east of the provincial capitals of Huesca and Teruel, while nationalists still held those heavily fortified cities. In the winter of 1937-38, a major battle unfolded at Teruel, where Republican forces, including many anarchist companies integrated into the regular Army's 22nd Corps, managed to seize the town in a freezing, bloody fight. Franco threw in elite reinforcements to counterattack, and by February 1938 retook a ruined Teruel. The Battle of Teruel exhausted both sides, but especially drained Franco's reserves, delaying his planned spring offensive. Battle of Guadalajara, March 1937. One of Franco's attempts to encircle Madrid involved an offensive at Guadalajara, led largely by the Italian Corpo Truppe Volontari, CTV, about 35,000 Italian fascist troops with armor and aircraft. Outside the town of Guadalajara, this Italian-led force was decisively beaten by Republican defenders, which included Spanish units and the Garibaldi Battalion of Italian anti-fascist volunteers. Italian bombers and tanks bogged down in rain and mud, and the Republican Army, bolstered by international brigades, counterattacked and routed the Italians. The victory at Guadalajara was a significant morale boost for the Republic and a humiliation for Mussolini. It marked the first time a fascist army was clearly defeated in pitched battle by anti-fascist forces. In our alternate timeline, Guadalajara unfolds much as it did historically. The Italians suffer heavy losses, over 400 killed and 1,800 wounded, and abandon large quantities of weapons and vehicles in their retreat. Many of those captured arms, including field guns, trucks, and machine guns, were gratefully incorporated into the Republican arsenal, helping to arm the anarchist columns which had been chronically undersupplied. Indeed, by mid-1937, the quality of weaponry among anarchist units had improved somewhat from the dire early days. They started the war with a motley collection of old rifles. Orwell noted that the militia's rifles were so obsolete you could not hit a man except by accident at distance. Swing, but later many units received modern Russian rifles, Mosin Nagants supplied by the USSR, or captured Italian 7.35mm Carcano rifles, greatly improving their firepower. War in the air and at sea, control of the skies and seas was fiercely contested. German and Italian planes, Messerschmitt fighters, Junkers, and Savoia bombers gave the nationalists initial air superiority, used for terror bombing of civilian areas like Guernica and Madrid. The Republican Air Force, augmented by a limited supply of Soviet-made fighters, Polikarpov Tu-115 Chatos and I-16 Moskos, fought valiantly to challenge this. In the anarchist zones, aircraft were scarce. However, an interesting development occurred in late 1936 when a group of anarchist and socialist volunteers in New York began secret flight training in response to a CNT appeal for pilots. A few of them eventually made it to Spain and flew as mercenaries in Republican colors. By 1938, though, the Republic was largely outgunned in the air as German Condor Legion units introduced more advanced planes. At sea, the Republican Navy, with its larger warships, maintained a blockade on nationalist ports and ensured that no major troop landings could threaten the anarchist-controlled eastern coast. Italian submarines covertly attacked Republican shipping in the Mediterranean, but after diplomatic protests and incidents where British merchant ships were struck, these attacks lessened. Overall, the nationalists' material superiority, planes, tanks, and ammunition, was partly balanced by the Republicans' higher manpower and the foreigners fighting on their side. Battle of the Ebro, July-November 1938. The Ebro offensive was the Republic's last major attempt to turn the tide. Led by the talented General Vicente Rojo and with the political backing of the now ruling National Defense Council, which included anarchist leader Juan Garcia Oliver as a member, the Republican Army crossed the Ebro River in Catalonia on July 25, 1938, catching Franco's forces off guard. Among the assaulting troops were conventional army units and mixed brigades of all ideologies. Notably, the 153rd Mixed Brigade, composed largely of anarchist militiamen who had agreed to a degree of militarization, regularization, in order to participate in larger operations. The Battle of the Ebro was the longest and bloodiest of the war. The Republicans initially advanced, but Franco redirected massive forces, including his best German-equipped units, to contain the breach. After 3 months of seesaw combat in the arid hills of Terra Alta, the offensive was spent. The Republicans ultimately had to retreat back across the Ebro by November, suffering huge casualties. However, the Battle of the Ebro drained Franco's army profoundly. Many of his most experienced battalions were decimated, and much of his ammunition stockpiled from Axis aid was expended. Observers would later say that while the Ebro was a defensive victory for Franco, it was a Pyrrhic one that left his armies overextended and exhausted on the eve of 1939. By the beginning of 1939, the war had reached a critical point. In the actual historical timeline, this was when the Republic collapsed internally, with a coup by Colonel Casado in Madrid against the communist influence, and Franco's final triumph in April 1939. In the alternate scenario, the dynamics were different. The anarchist-socialist bloc remained relatively cohesive and in charge, having marginalized the communists. The Republican zone, though war-weary and economically strained, maintained higher popular morale due to the social revolution and the hope it engendered. Franco's nationalists, meanwhile, had expended their high tide of momentum. Their offensives in late 1938 failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Notably, Franco did not succeed in splitting the Republican territory along the Mediterranean coast as he had in the real world. Historically, Franco reached the Mediterranean at Vinaròs in April 1938, cutting Catalonia off. In this scenario, that thrust was thwarted by stubborn Republican defense around Castellón and by the diversion of troops to the Ebro battle. The Nationalist Army was now stretched thin, holding long lines in hostile territory and controlling millions of unwilling civilians in occupied provinces. Partisan resistance and sabotage behind nationalist lines grew, especially in the Basque and Asturian regions Franco had occupied. Guerrilla bands, sometimes led by anarchists or nationalists who escaped capture, harassed Franco's supply routes, a precursor to the broader Maquis guerrilla war that would persist in later years. Sensing the enemy's weakness, the Republican High Command, now headquartered in Barcelona, prepared a final series of counteroffensives for early 1939. With extraordinary effort, they concentrated what remained of their tanks, artillery, and the most battle-hardened units, including international volunteers, for a push in the south. In February-March 1939, as Franco moved units to renew attacks on Catalonia, the Republicans struck in Andalusia, where Franco's grip was weakest. Anarchist columns under Cipriano Mera, a former bricklayer turned brilliant militia commander, and socialist regular divisions coordinated an attack that liberated the city of Córdoba and threatened to encircle the nationalist forces in Seville. At the same time, a spontaneous uprising of leftist workers in Seville itself, who had been living under brutal occupation, paralyzed the nationalist defense there. In late March 1939, Seville fell to the Republican forces, delivering a crushing blow to the nationalist rear. This victory cut off Franco's Army of Africa, much of which was deployed further north, from its supply base. Nationalist morale plummeted and the fragility of their supply lines was exposed. General Franco attempted to consolidate his remaining forces for a last stand in the old Castile and Leon heartland, but events overtook him. In early April 1939, elements of the Republican Army of the Center, spearheaded by the 14th Division, an anarchist-led formation renowned as Los Tigres Ibéricos, launched a surprise assault near Guadalajara, punching through a weak point in the front and advancing toward Burgos, the makeshift nationalist capital. At this point, nationalist resistance began to disintegrate. Exhausted, outnumbered, and now facing uprisings in their rear areas, many nationalist units surrendered or melted away. On April 14, 1939, symbolically the 8th anniversary of the Republic, Burgos was captured by Republican columns. General Franco, refusing to flee, reportedly committed suicide as the anarchist battalion Death to Fascism closed in on his headquarters. Alternative accounts claim he was shot by his own guard or captured and executed by vengeful militia. The exact fate of Franco became a topic of later historical debate. What is certain is that the Nationalist High Command collapsed. By the end of April 1939, all major nationalist forces had laid down arms. The Spanish Civil War, after nearly 3 years of bloody fighting, concluded with a Republican victory, a radical reversal of the actual historical outcome, aftermath and post-war reconstruction. The end of the war marked not only a military victory over fascism in Spain, but also the culmination of the anarchist social revolution. The society that emerged from the conflict was unlike any Europe had seen. Spain became a decentralized workers' federation, often referred to by historians as Revolutionary Spain or the Federation of Free Territories of Iberia. The traditional organs of the state, courts, army, police, parliament, had largely dissolved during the war and were replaced by revolutionary institutions built from the ground up. Political organization. In place of the old unitary Spanish state, power was federated. Local communities, Villages, towns, urban neighborhoods were governed by popular assemblies of workers and residents. These assemblies managed day-to-day issues and sent elected, recallable delegates to regional councils and a national congress. In 1939, while the guns were barely cooling, a congress of unions and community councils met in Valencia to draft the basis of a libertarian socialist constitution. The CNT and UGT, the socialist-led General Union of Workers, together formed the core of a new polity rather than a central government. A federal committee coordinated defense, foreign affairs, and large-scale economic planning, but it operated under the oversight of worker and peasant congresses. Federica Montseny, an anarchist who had served as health minister during the war, one of the first female ministers in Europe, emerged as a leading figure in post-war social policy, helping to organize public health and education on egalitarian lines. Justice and public order were maintained by innovative means in line with anarchist principles. Instead of reconstituting a bourgeois police force, safety committees and local militias ensured security, with an emphasis on community mediation. Revolutionary tribunals did operate to address wartime atrocities. Some top fascist officers and officials captured were put on trial for crimes like massacre and torture. A few notable figures of the Franco regime who survived, such as General Queipo de Llano and some leaders of the Falange, were executed after convictions for crimes against the people. However, the victors largely rejected indiscriminate reprisals. Inspired by anarchist ideals of transformative justice, they sought to avoid a cycle of vengeance. Imprisonment was used sparingly, with more focus on rehabilitating former rank-and-file nationalist soldiers into the new society. This approach was not without controversy or exceptions. In some areas, local anger led to lynchings of notorious Civil Guard commanders or Falangist informers before authorities could intervene. Economically, collectivization continued and deepened. During the war, about 75% of Catalonia's economy and 70% of Aragon's agriculture had been collectivized under worker control. After the war, these figures reached nearly 100% in many regions, since remaining big landowners and capitalists had mostly fled or been expropriated. The new social order was one of workers' self-management. Factories were run by elected workers' committees, large farms became cooperatives, transportation, public utilities, and even services like restaurants and theaters were managed by those who worked in them. Money was still used in the cities. It proved impractical to abolish currency overnight, but in the countryside, many collectivized villages operated on principles of from each according to ability to each according to need, using shared warehouses for distribution of goods. Urban workplaces often coordinated through industrial federations. For example, the Transport Federation managed railways, trams, and shipping across regions. Economic coordination across Spain was handled by a federation of collectives which tried to balance supply and demand by linking agrarian communes with industrial centers. This vast experiment in planned, stateless socialism encountered challenges, shortages, bureaucratic snags, and occasional localism, but it carried forward the remarkable momentum of the 1936 revolution. Foreign observers in 1940 remarked that Iberia was undergoing the greatest social transformation in Western Europe since the French Revolution, with the working class in direct control of the economy. Social policies were equally radical. The new regime implemented the full program of progressive reforms long demanded by the left. The separation of church and state was absolute. The powerful Catholic Church was stripped of the vast privileges and property it had held. Much of the church's land was already collectivized, and many monasteries became schools or hospitals. Marriage became a civil registry matter, with divorce legalized, as the Republic had done, and made easily accessible. Women who had been active in both production and combat, the anarchist women's organization Mujeres Libres had formed women's militias and promoted female literacy during the war, gained unprecedented rights in revolutionary Spain. Full legal equality for women was affirmed. Efforts were made to establish child care centers, maternity clinics, and educational programs to integrate women fully into public life. In rural Andalusia, Peasants ended the patronage system, and old gender norms began to erode as women took on leadership roles in village councils, something almost unthinkable before. The influence of anarchist philosophy was evident in everyday governance. For instance, criminal justice was reshaped around principles of restorative justice rather than punishment. Drawing from ideas of Kropotkin's mutual aid and other libertarian thinkers, community tribunals aimed to rehabilitate offenders and reconcile conflicts without prisons when possible. In the early 1940s, one famous case in revolutionary Iberia involved a former fascist sniper who had killed several militia members. Instead of execution, a Barcelona neighborhood assembly, including victims' families, agreed on a form of restitution. The sniper was sentenced to work rebuilding housing for war refugees and to participate in political education sessions under oversight of a justice committee. This approach, while not always as idyllic or uniformly applied as later legends suggested, set revolutionary Spain apart from the punitive justice systems elsewhere. Internationally, the victory of Republican Spain sent shockwaves across Europe. It marked the first defeat of fascism in a major conflict, coming just months before World War II would erupt. Reactions were mixed. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, of course, were furious and dealt a strategic blow. They had invested heavily in Franco's victory and now found an avowedly anti-fascist revolutionary regime in the Iberian Peninsula. Hitler in particular lamented that the Spanish War, instead of yielding him an ally, had created a breeding ground of Bolshevist anarchy on France's southern border. Some in the Nazi high command considered plans to invade Spain during the coming war, Operation Isabella, to extinguish the revolutionary threat and secure bases, but these plans were shelved when the war in the East against the USSR consumed Germany's focus. Portugal, under the right-wing dictator Salazar, became a refuge for fleeing Spanish nationalists and glared anxiously at its now radical neighbor. Border clashes occurred in 1940 when Spanish guerrillas gave support to Portuguese anarchists, but an outright war never materialized as Portugal was diplomatically isolated and Britain quietly warned Salazar against provoking conflict that might aid the Axis. The Western democracies, Britain and France, had been ambivalent or hostile to the Spanish Republic, even when it was bourgeois democratic. A social revolutionary Spain alarmed them even more. During the final months of the Civil War, Britain in particular had contemplated recognizing Franco's regime. Instead, now it refused to immediately recognize the new revolutionary Iberian government. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain privately described the outcome in Spain as deeply regrettable, a red Bolshevik tyranny replacing Franco's would-be stable government. France's position was complicated by its Popular Front government's leftist sympathies and the flood of refugees, both Spaniards from earlier in the war and now defeated nationalists, at its borders. In public, Paris maintained a wary neutrality. However, with the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, geopolitics shifted dramatically. The Allies, Britain and now Charles de Gaulle's Free French by 1940, found it pragmatic to seek at least benevolent neutrality from revolutionary Spain. Spain itself, exhausted from its own war, adopted an official stance of neutrality in World War II, much as Franco's Spain did historically, but for very different reasons. The anarchist-led government had no love for Hitler or Mussolini. Thousands of Spaniards volunteered to fight against the Axis anyway. For instance, entire battalions of Spanish anti-fascists would later join the French resistance and General Leclerc's Free French forces in North Africa and the liberation of Paris. But the Iberian Federation was not formally aligned with the Allied powers either. They distrusted British and French imperialism and capitalist motives. Nonetheless, by 1942, with the Axis threatening to overrun Europe, informal cooperation grew between Spain and the Allied intelligence services. British agents discreetly met with CNT representatives in Lisbon to ensure that Spain would not allow Hitler to use its territory. Hitler had courted Franco for an alliance. In this timeline, there was no Franco to court. and the anarchist leaders had absolutely no intention of assisting fascism. Revolutionary Spain thus survived World War II intact, somewhat isolated but increasingly acknowledged as the de facto government of Spain by the end of the war. In 1944, Mexico and the USSR were the first to establish formal diplomatic relations with the Federation of Free Territories. For Mexico, it was ideologically sympathetic. The USSR, though anti-anarchist, pragmatically preferred a neutral Spain to an Axis Spain. Britain and the United States held off official recognition until the war's end. Only in 1945, when the United Nations was formed, was revolutionary Iberia grudgingly invited to send observers. Spain did not formally join the UN until later due to U.S. objections, similar to how Franco's Spain was initially ostracized. In the long run, the success of the Spanish anarchist revolution had profound inspirational effects worldwide. It proved that a worker-led social revolution was possible in an industrialized country, even in the face of foreign intervention. This energized leftist and anti-colonial movements across the globe. In Latin America, for instance, the victory in Spain emboldened populist and socialist currents. By the 1940s and 50s, activists in countries like Cuba were explicitly citing the Spanish example. Indeed, in the alternate timeline, when a revolution ousted Cuban dictator Batista in 1959, the Cuban anarchists, stronger than in reality due to their Spanish comrades' success, played a significant role alongside Fidel Castro's July 26 movement, steering Cuba into joining the Iberian-led Federation rather than the Soviet bloc. Cuba became one of several free territories allied with revolutionary Spain by the 1960s. Similarly, decolonization struggles in French and British colonies took heart. The Vietnamese revolutionaries under Ho Chi Minh and the Algerian FLN both had factions influenced by anarchist or libertarian socialist thought, cross-pollinated from the Spanish experience. Within Europe, the presence of a radical Iberian federation on the doorstep of France kept the post-Webby order interesting. Franco's historical fascist dictatorship never existed to drag down Spain's economy or persecute its people. Instead, revolutionary Spain had to forge a new society under continued economic embargoes from some Western powers. Over time, however, Spain's practical successes, high literacy, low unemployment through collective work, and lack of feudal poverty, gained admiration. By the late 1940s, France, under a socialist government after the war, reopened trade, and Britain too quietly engaged in commerce, especially once the Cold War set in and the West saw more value in a neutral Spain than pushing it towards the Soviet camp. The United States remained openly hostile at first, equating anarchism with communism, but even Washington found itself attempting some mild containment via engagement strategy by the 1950s. Revolutionary Spain thus survived into the second half of the 20th century, a living experiment in anarchist socialist governance. It did face internal challenges, generational shifts, debates over the degree of decentralization versus coordination, occasional resurgence of conservative Catholic sentiment in some locales, etc., but it became firmly established as a different model of society. In later decades, Spaniards would refer to the Civil War period as the Libertarian Revolution, emphasizing that it was both a war of national defense and a social revolution. To this day, in the alternate timeline, the Federation of Free Territories with revolutionary Iberia at its core stands as testament to the road not taken in history, a decentralized, stateless federation that emerged from the crucible of the Spanish Civil War. Legacy. The alternate Spanish Civil War thus ended with the triumph of the leftist revolutionaries and the prevention of nearly 4 decades of fascist dictatorship that scarred real-world Spain. Its legacy has been far-reaching. Culturally and socially, the Spanish working class proved themselves not only capable of fighting fascism, but of constructing a new society based on solidarity and equality. The war itself became a legend among global progressives, songs, literature, and art celebrating it abound, from the poems of Nicolas Guillen to the murals in Mexico City depicting anarchist militiamen. In academic circles, countless analyses have been written about how the anarchist victory was achieved. Often, credit is given to the combination of ideological unity, grassroots internationalism, and strategic boldness at key moments, such as the decision to arm the workers in 1936, or to not compromise with the Stalinists in 1937. Military historians point out that while the nationalists had better equipment, they faced constant popular insurgency in areas they occupied and a unified enemy leadership in the Republicans after 1937, something lacking in the real Civil War where infighting undermined the Republic.